right, let's go ahead and get started. We have a lot to cover. As always, if you have questions, clarification, you can raise your little Zoom hand. You can just unmute yourself and say, hey, Amy, I'll stop and listen. You can throw it in the chat box. I do have the chat box open as well. So our goal today is that we're going to cover, CAR likes to do forms updates generally twice a year. They did sneak one in there this year in May. But now it's June, and those two updates, right? It's June and December. So they like to screw with your summer, and they like to mess up your holiday season as well. It never fails that you get a call like in between Christmas and New Year's from a client that's like, hey, I want to put an offer in on a house. You go to pull up the residential purchase agreement. You're like, oh my gosh, this looks different, right? They really like to mess with us. I don't know why we can't do it in like March and September or something. It would make more sense, but they do the forms updates in June. Most of the forms, the new updated forms were released last week. So if you've been in there, you may have seen a couple of changes. We're going to cover most of the forms that are pertinent to us and our business. I'm not covering business and commercial forms. I'm not covering the lease and rental forms. There's a few forms that aren't in the CAR forms library yet, and I don't have copies of. They were new forms that were supposed to be released with this release. So I'm just going to go over those real quick, but I don't have examples for you. There's supposed to be a BFPI form coming out. So BFPI, it's Buyer Financial and Personal Information. It goes along with the BRBC. They're on like one of the last pages of the BRBC. There's a little space that says that the buyer is to provide financial information, proving that they can qualify for a home within 5 days of signed agreement. So that BFPI form goes along with that. It's going to help the buyer's agent assess the buyer's qualifications for the property that they want to purchase. Factors such as source of down payment, like where's that down payment coming from, max loan amount, type of financing, whether they currently rent or own a home, if they have experience with property, or if the buyer has like a real estate license, right? So everything on that form is confidential. It's not something that you pass on to like a seller, but it's just for you to determine that eligibility. Where's everything coming from? What do we need to know? So you can start utilizing that form if you would like once it comes out. Again, that one's not officially out, but it's a new form that's supposed to be released sometime very soon. The other form that has not yet come out is the BIPP form, and that's the Buyer Identification of Preferences and Priorities. And you're like, Amy, what in the world is that? The goal of that form is that the BRBC sets minimum requirements, right, to establish a broker's right to compensation, right? As far as like at the top, we talk about area, we talk about like what price range, right? If we find them a home or they buy a home in that price range or in that area, then you would be due a commission. The BIPP form helps the buyer's agent to know what is important to the buyer, such as price range, number of bedrooms and bathrooms, single story versus multi-level, school district, green features, accessibility features. Again, the information that's going to be filled out on that form by a potential buyer is going to be confidential, and it may tweak and change over time. And this BIPP form is going to replace the CAR buyer material issues form. So just kind of keep that in mind. I'm not sure how necessarily it replaces that form, but that's what it's going to do. It's going to replace that form, the BIPP. Not that anybody ever used that BMI form, the buyer material issues form, but it's the same idea as like when we sit down and do our buyer consultation, we ask them what's important to them and why it's important to them and what's important about that feature. This form just helps somebody who hasn't already been doing that, give the buyer something that they can fill out to instruct on what kind of houses they want to look for. Why is it important to know what a buyer is looking for? Number one, you don't have to spend time looking at homes that don't match their criteria. And number two, it helps them to refocus, right? So it gives us that reason of, hey, like you mentioned, one of your must-haves is 4 bedrooms. The home that you just sent me to look at only has 3 bedrooms. Are you sure that's a home that you want to look at, right? It gives us that ability to qualify those homes and not waste our time showing them homes that don't match their criteria. So that form, again, it's not yet in the CAR forms library. I'm thinking it'll be there very soon, but that's the BIPP form. The next one, is this one's already come out. It's attached to our, I don't know why maybe I didn't try to pull this one up, but the BCA form. This one came out in May and it's attached to the listing agreement. It's also attached to the BRBC. It's the broker compensation advisory. It just lists how people get paid in the transaction. And it states that commission is negotiable. So again, if you want to see that one, we've covered it. I've covered it. Ed's covered it, but that's that BCA form. It's attached, like I said, to the BRBC. It's also attached to the listing agreement. You would want to make sure that you cover the pertinent section with whoever you're representing, whether it's the buyer or the seller. All right. The other new forms that are coming out, they're just going to be short term. I don't know why they're not out yet. I would expect them to already be there, but it's the DMBR and the DMLA. So one of them is the disclosure and modification to buyer representation agreements. And it's really truly only used to modify representation agreements that were in effect prior to June. Okay, so if you have a BRBC in effect, then you would want to include this. You'd want to go back and have them sign this DMRR because it goes over some nuances that have been changed on the new BRBC or changes that were made. So the other option is just next time you go to write an offer, have them re-sign a BRBC form. That's probably what I would do, especially since this form isn't out yet. Any previous prior to June forms that you have signed, you may want to just have them re-signed so that they're signing the new copy of it. And just so you know, oftentimes, if you already have one in your transaction file, you've got to actually remove it from the transaction file and re-add it for it to be the updated version. So just something to keep in mind. The DMLA, which also is supposed to be out, again, it's temporary form. It's used to modify a listing agreement that was signed prior to June. You probably wouldn't want to re-sign a listing agreement. So keep an eye out for that DMLA form, disclosure and modification to that listing agreement. It informs the seller that offering compensation through the MLS will be prohibited once the NAR proposed settlement is implemented. That's going to be most likely sometime this month. Broker's efforts to offer compensation outside the MLS will satisfy the broker's duties as seller. The form should be used prior to the expected July 2024 implementation date. There's no need to use the form for listings taken after the revised release of the revised RLA in June. Okay, so just some things to keep in mind there. So only if it was signed before. The other one that is not yet in the forms library, that's a new form that should be being released, is the LPRBC, the Limited Property Representation and Broker Compensation Agreement. Just so you guys know, there's a few forms coming out that have to do with representation because of the whole NAR thing, as well as open houses when you host open houses. So with the Limited Property Representation and Broker Compensation Agreements, one of the proposed NAR settlement items is that agents working with a buyer need to have that buyer representation agreement signed prior to showing a property, right? So like whether you choose to use a BRBC or not is going out the window. You will be forced to use a BRBC. It will be required on every transaction before you go show the property. They're slushing out what that's going to look like with regards to open houses, right? So they've developed this LPRBC form, Limited Property Representation and Broker Compensation Agreement. It would only be available as a non-exclusive agreement, meaning it can be canceled by the broker or the buyer. Technically, it's a broker or visitor. You would use this at open houses potentially. It's got a maximum representation of 30 days before it expires. If it's used, if you are the listing agent of the property, it's only valid for the property that you're holding open, not additional properties. If you're not a listing agent, you're holding somebody else's listing open, then it goes that 30-day period. So the LPRBC is not a buyer representation agreement. It's really just for open houses. It's limited to 3 properties. It's limited to 30 days. So we'll be going over that form more in detail once they make a decision of how open houses are going to work. No, you won't see anything on the screen. Well, it's got, yeah, we're just looking at the purchase agreement right now, because I'm just going through the summary of the new forms that I made notes of that are not yet in that forms library. So you've got that LPRBC form. We will talk more about that once we find it's been released and once they make a decision. We also have a modification of terms to the listing agreement, and they're going to separate out a modification of terms to the buyer representation agreement. Again, we're not seeing those forms in the library yet, so they're still working on those. But you will see both that modification of terms right now is intertwined. So it's a modification of terms, the buyer representation or listing agreement. That's going to be separated out. So you'll have one for listings and one for buyers. Amanda, not a stupid question. Yes, once the forms get released, they automatically will update your forms library. Absolutely. So all the other new forms we're going to be covering today, after I finish, I think I'm on the last one now. Those we'll all find in your car forms library. The other one that they're going to release, that again, not seeing it in the car forms library yet, but is the open house visitor non-agency disclosure. Again, that comes back with, if you're working with a buyer, you need to have a buyer representation agreement signed prior to showing a property. We're still trying to figure out what that looks like with regards to open houses. So this is one of the additional forms they're talking about adding in order to satisfy that if it is a requirement for you to host open houses. The OHNA form, or the open house visitor non-agency disclosure, informs visitors that they're not in an agency relationship with the listing agent and therefore not working with the agent. We don't know if it will just need to be signed by everybody who passes through your open house. I know what you guys are thinking. I'm done with open houses. Please don't. Open houses are still going to be fabulous and amazing. Or if this form may need to get signed, or it may need to just be visible. We'll find out more as this month progresses. If the visitor already has another broker working on their behalf, so they already have a representation agreement in place, then it would inform the listing agent of who the other agent is working with to avoid conflicts, and not violating the NAR code of ethics. So those forms are ones that we're not going to necessarily cover today. I'm just giving you the overview to look for them in case they happen to pop up and you see them. They aren't yet released. And so now let's continue on. So the rest of these forms, those are all the new forms. The rest of these that we're covering today are all forms that had changes to them for that. And remember, anytime a form has changes, it's going to be highlighted. The abbreviation of the last form was an OH. I don't know. OH. Hold on. OHNA. OHNA. All right. So these are all ones that have been changed. Again, top of the form, it's going to tell you what the revision date was. Okay. So you'll always be able to see what the revision date was. So sometimes I'll be scrolling through forms, like in May, I was scrolling through forms and go, oh my gosh, like I don't remember this form before. Am I just that stupid, or is this a new form? And I just look at the top of the form and it was like 5 of 24 and I knew it was a new form. So here we go. The California Residential Purchase Agreement, all the purchase agreements have been updated. So whether it's the California residential, whether it's the income property, the new home residential purchase agreement, right? It doesn't matter. They were all updated. I'm only going to cover the RPA. It's going to be updated for the new pages, because when they make changes, it sometimes updates the number of pages. So you'll see that there, it's in red. And then the change that was made, the big change that was made, is right here on ELF, they have added in for us a contingency. So the insurance used to be included as part of the investigation contingency. It is now its own contingency in the state of California. So keep that in mind. We now have a new separate contingency for insurance. It's going to default to 17 days after acceptance. Yes, Melina also has changed this contingency removal form. Yes. Common interest disclosures, they just added where to reference it legally. And then Review of leased and liened items. It gave us examples down here. They've added that as well. Again, everything's been renumbered now in this grid or in the L grid. So there we go. And then here, tenant occupied, seller shall disclose if occupied by anyone other than the seller. It states that further down in the paragraphs of the RPA, but they clarified it here. So it could be the seller's sister that occupies the home. If the seller's not there, it's considered tenant occupied. All right, continuing on, they've updated some of the paragraphs and things here. We're just going to skip over that because it really doesn't matter. They've put the word optional here, optional wildfire disclosure. It's not required on all properties. So just know that they've added that wildfire disclosure report as optional. They put a provided byline on there. They also gave you a secondary option for reports here with buyer seller. So now you have 2 blank report lines that you could fill out. Do keep in mind that anytime we fill in reports on the residential purchase agreement, the lender is going to want to see those reports. So just be careful and cautious with that. I would be hesitant to be like, seller to pay for a home inspection report, because now the lender is going to want to see it. So there's those changes. And then down here in the paragraphs, we have right here. Oh, this is a really important one. So the condition of property on closing, they've updated this, and I'm actually glad they kind of did, because this has caused issues with my closings in the past. So down here, condition of the property, unless otherwise agreed, except as specified in paragraph 9C, we'll go down there in a minute. Seller is not responsible to repair any holes left after the removal of any wall hanging, such as pictures and mirrors, brackets, nails, and other fastening devices. Okay, so the seller's not required to patch holes anymore in their walls. And you're like, Amy, that's horrible. I agree that most buyers want the holes patched, but here's what I've had problems with buyers. The sellers don't do a good job of patching those holes, and then they try to touch up the paint with a paint that didn't match in the first place. And now we've got like shiny spots that don't match all over the walls where the texture doesn't match, or, you know, whatever. So I'm actually glad that the seller is not supposed to do that anymore. I think it'll stop a lot of headaches. We're going to scroll down here and just look at 9C. Is this 9C or 8C? That's 8C. We'll come back up to that one. 9C is just items excluded from the sale. Okay, so there you go. Just because it referenced it. The other thing here is D. So remember that contingency that got added there on the grid for the insurance. This agreement is as specified in paragraph 3L4, contingent upon the buyer's assessment of the availability and approval of the cost for any insurance policy desired under this agreement. So keep in mind, there's 2 parts to that. It's the availability and the cost. So just because insurance is available doesn't mean the buyers can't cancel based on that contingency right there. Okay, because if it's more than they want to spend for insurance, then we can put that on there. I think personally it'd be nice if that insurance line had like a maximum amount that the buyer was willing to pay for insurance, so the buyer can't be like, well, I was expecting my insurance to be $500 a year and it's $1,000, so now I'm canceling. Because this is kind of one of those that's like open to interpretation. And I mean, you can, any reason, any cost of the insurance, the buyer could utilize that to cancel. So I think it's a little vague. That being said, I'm glad it's separated out. So there you go, insurance. Let's see, I think that's the last real update to this form, to the purchase agreements. Oh, no, there's not. There's a whole new form that was released. We'll go over it here in a minute. But so in was added here, 11 in, balconies, exterior stairways, and other elevated elements for properties with, and I don't know why they limited it to 3, but for properties with any building containing 3 or more dwelling units with elevated balconies, stairways, or other elements. So these are for like multi-family homes, right? Triplex, fourplex, and above. Okay. Elevated balconies, stairways, and other elements. The seller shall, within the time specified in paragraph 3(1), deliver to buyer the wooden balcony and stairs addendum, CAR Form WBSA, and comply with its terms. Okay, I don't know why they did 3 units. Obviously, there's some law probably floating around out there. It seems like they would have done like more than 4 units, but they did it at 3, which is weird because 4 is considered residential. So why not 2? I don't know. Anyways, there you go. But if you're selling the triplex or more, you need to be aware of this, or if your buyer is buying one, just be aware of that. Let's see. The buyer investigations do not include, among other things, an assessment of the availability of the general cost of homeowners insurance. They took that out of the buyer's investigation portion. So that's what you're seeing there in red because they made it its own contingency. So it's no longer part of the buyer's investigation. All right, let's see here. Buyers advised not to remove contingencies related to review of documents until after the documents have been delivered. They did that there. Only because, right, oftentimes we go in with like a non-contingent offer, removing all of our contingencies, but the seller disclosures haven't been delivered yet. We don't have the ability to cancel based on those seller disclosures, no matter what's in them, if we've removed that contingency before we've received them. If we've received the contingents or all those seller disclosures, we remove our contingency and then we get new material information about the property. That resets, that gives us 5 more days to review that one item to decide whether we want to cancel or not. But if we haven't reviewed anything, we remove that contingency, we lose that right. Okay, let's see here. Notice, the notice to the buyer or seller to perform the demand to close escrow has been changed. We'll go over that. And let's see. If the notice for multiple items, just clarifying that if a notice to perform was given for multiple items, the notice shall be valid for all contingencies and contractual actions for which the delivery of the notice is within the time permitted in the agreement and void as to the others. So if you've delivered it too soon for something and in time for the other, anything that was permitted under that contingency removal or not contingency removal, the notice to perform is valid. Anything else is considered invalid. So keep in mind that we're not allowed to serve, like I can't serve that notice to perform today if it's not due for 5 days. We have to serve it within the time period. Let's see here. Compensation, seller agrees to pay the obligation. If seller agrees to pay the obligation of buyer to compensate buyer's broker, right? Seller shall be entitled to a written copy of the portion of the compensation agreement between buyer and buyer's broker. So it's just saying, hey, if we're using that SPBB form and asking the seller to fill the gap between the compensation due and what the listing agent is giving us, what the listing brokerage is giving us, if the seller's paying that difference, they're entitled to a copy of that BRBC showing the amount of compensation that the buyer agreed to pay us. Okay, only when using the SPBB form.
Amy, on that, so yeah, just to clarify, we're not sending them the full BRBC, we're only sending them the SPBB, correct?
No, so the SPBB form is the form that we would use in addition to the purchase agreement to negotiate the difference. Let's say
if there's a difference.
Yeah, if there's a difference, right?
Now,
Seller's brokerage is offering X, we agreed to Y. So we're asking seller to pay the difference between X and Y. We use the SPBB form. If you're going to use the SPBB form, you'd want to include the page of your BRBC form that shows the commission that the buyer agreed to pay to you or the compensation.
Okay, so not the full form of the BRBC.
Yeah, you don't have to include the whole BRBC, just the portion of it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right. Let's see here. We've got in 19D, escrow holder shall provide to buyer and seller, either jointly or separately, a closing statement or other written documentation showing the amount of compensation paid to respectively the buyer's broker and seller's broker. So it's just got to be disclosed now because we want to make sure that everybody is getting paid. And since it might come from normally, like if compensation is being paid from the seller, it appears on the seller's statement, not the buyer's statement. And since the buyer is going to be responsible for paying their portion of the commission or a portion or the commission, it's just making sure that the buyer knows where commission came from. so that we don't get paid from the seller and then also get paid separately from the buyer more than their obligation. So that's why they are going to get a copy of the compensation that was paid out. So that's now in there. Oh, we've got the delivered, right? So electronic delivery of forms, right? They changed that a couple of years ago. There's a little box that you check for where you want the electronic delivery to be next to your signature block. So there's a new modification of that in case you need to change where that electronically or you opt out or it didn't get filled out on the residential purchase agreement. Because technically, if it's not filled out on the residential purchase agreement, documents should be delivered by hand. They should be delivered in person. So if we didn't fill it out on the residential purchase agreement, we would need to use the modification form, which we'll cover here in a little bit. But it just talks about here, a document or as applicable, link to a document shall be deemed in possession if it located in the inbox for the applicable party or authorized agent. Right, unless otherwise agreed car form. This is the new car form, or maybe it was always there and we just didn't know it, the DEDA form. So it says delivery of documents unless otherwise agreed means it shall be effective upon personal receipt of the document by buyer, seller, or their authorized agent. Personal receipt means a copy of the document as applicable, link to the document is in the possession of the party or authorized agent regardless of the delivery method used, email, text, or other. A document or applicable link to the document shall be deemed in possession if it's located, that's bad English, hopefully they fix that on the final version, in the inbox for the applicable party or authorized agent, or an electronic copy of the document as applicable, link to the document has been sent to the designated electronic delivery specified in the real estate broker section unless otherwise agreed with car form DEDA. So most forms are like when they're delivered. If we check the box for electronic delivery, then it's when we have proof that we sent it to the correct email address that considers it delivered. We don't have to verify that it's in their inbox. Okay. Fair Appraisal Notice Act. They've put the wording for the Fair Appraisal Act. Remember, we have that notice into the contract. I haven't looked yet on the residential purchase agreement. Maybe they've deleted that form, so we have one less signature. Hopefully that's the case. They put it in here and took it out. But this just talks about that Fair Appraisal Act notice. Okay. That we shouldn't discriminate. If property is sold under the jurisdiction of probate court, buyer identified as executor or administrator, or by simplified, they just added this so that we know that it can be John Doe executor or estate conservatorship of John Doe could be the name that we put on the signature line. Okay. Full name of the entity. If trust, enter the court complete trust name. If under probate, enter the name of the estate, including the case number. So they just updated the entity buyers there so that it can be fully completed, and provides for more clarification because there's always been this like gray area when it comes to how we handle the name of the executor of an estate. The trust is one thing because that was already clarified. Again, same thing updated here under the entity sellers as with the entity buyers. Confirmation of offered compensation. Let's see here. Seller's broker agrees to pay buyer's broker, and buyer's broker agrees to accept out of seller's broker's proceeds in escrow the compensation specified in a separate written agreement. We're going to use car form CBC. So moving forward, we want to confirm the commission with the car form CBC. That form's been around for a long time. We're just going to see it more often. Each broker agrees to disclose to the seller or buyer, the client, the amount in the CBC. That's just the confirmation of broker compensation. So we'll start using those forms because with it not being stated, every time we submit an offer, we want to include that CBC form. When we've confirmed what the listing agent, if any, commission is being offered by the listing agent to the buyer's agent as a co-op.
So Amy, that's coming from, is that attached to the RPA or something we need to pay attention to attach it?
It's not my guess. I haven't looked at the RPA to see what documents are still attached and what aren't. But my guess is that it's not attached, so you'll just need to add it as part of your templates.
And then in terms of the listing side, is that's something we could request to see from the listing agent?
Yeah, well, no, so if I would, yeah, so if I was submitting an offer on a property, once they remove the compensation from the MLS, you'll want to call up Fran and be like, hey, Fran, it's Amy. I'm getting ready to write an offer on your property, right? Same conversation as normal. Do you have any offers? How many showings have you had? Are you reviewing offers as received? Great. Is there anything I can do to make this transition easier for your sellers when I draw up my offer? And are you offering any is the seller, are you offering any compensation to me as the buyer's agent? Oh yeah, we're offering whatever X%, right? And then you're gonna write your offer, you're gonna fill out that CBC form with confirmation of what was verbally communicated to you as the commission being offered.
Okay, so that solidifies that the seller is offering, and then we submit our forms from the BRBC showing that we're in contract in X terms or whatever that may be, right?
Yeah, so you'll submit the offer, you'll submit it with that CBC form. The other agent, Fran, in this instance, since I used her as an example, Fran would sign that CBC form confirming that she is, that I will be receiving X% commission from the listing brokerage.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep. And then if you're going to use the SPBB, maybe she's only offering X. Buyer has agreed to pay Y. So we're asking seller to cover the difference of Z. We would use the SPBB form. So you might have the CBC form and the SPBB form in the transaction at the same time. Or again, we can always negotiate that difference in compensation as a closing cost credit, right? Back to the buyer. So there's different ways to do it. We can use the SPBB form, or we could just negotiate it back as a closing cost credit. So there's a couple ways there to do that.
I have one more question on that. I was
Yeah.
hearing rumors that you cannot negotiate up. So as if say I'm in contract with my buyer at 2.5 and the listing agent is offering 3, I can't take that extra 0.5%.
So let's make sure that when we have conversations about commission, just so we don't get in trouble for saying that there's average or specific set commissions, we're going to use commission X or bananas or apples. So
Sorry.
yes, if no, that's not true. The BRBC specifies where the additional commission goes. So if buyer agreed to pay X, sellers paid more than what the buyer agreed to pay, our listing agent's brokerage is offering compensation higher than what we signed on our BRBC for the buyer to pay. It specifies on that BRBC where the additional commission is going to go, whether it goes to us, whether it gets split with whether it goes to the buyer, whether it gets split with the buyer 50-50 or whatever. So there's different terms that you can stipulate there.
On the SPBB?
On the BRBC.
Oh, okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, the only time we would ever use the SPBB form is if the listing brokerage is offering less than what the buyer agreed to pay us to represent them, and we wanted to attempt to negotiate that difference directly with the seller as commission. Okay, that's the only time we use the SPBB form, is there's a shortfall in the commission and we want to negotiate that difference with the seller. Okay. In addition, the signature line here gives a box for the attached DITA form, which we'll go over. That's a different alternative delivery method. We can indicate that on the DITA. Otherwise, we have designated electronic delivery addresses, email above or blank, right? So there's an email here. So if we don't fill in this line, it's just going to automatically default to the email above. Okay. Any other questions on the purchase agreements? And again, all the purchase agreements have been updated with the majority of this information. Amanda, you also had a question about, should you have, the forms aren't available yet. So no, yeah, I wouldn't worry about it quite yet. Just check. I would check the car forms library like every Friday before your open houses to see if those new forms have been updated yet and released.
So then I would have to have them in hand for every person that's not represented?
So no, so the open house form, again, they're trying to decide whether they're gonna have to sign off on it or whether you just need to have it posted, but until we receive further instructions, I would just have it posted. We're still waiting for them to slush out the details of the whole settlement.
So, I think I saw some verbiage about that. Is there something like a template that we could use that anyone has available for what we need to post to be, clear?
Yeah, I mean, you could pull up a copy of this, of the form, oh no, of because it doesn't have a copy of it. I don't know. You may want to reach out to Car Legal and ask them directly if it's required at this time or not. Otherwise I would just hold off. Just keep checking. Check that car forms library. All right. The next form that had updates is going to be our manufactured or mobile home purchase addendum. This one, I'm just including this one because we have so many mobile homes in our office with all the Zillow leads. So just know that they updated it. That in section 11, it talks about, occupancy and condition of property. Occupy a used manufacturer mobile home. It just talks about all the things that could be wrong with it here. And it just says, hey, broker recommendation. The broker recommends that buyer obtain an inspection to determine if the property is in compliance with the above requirements. Broker does not have expertise in this area. So it's just adding that little disclaimer at the bottom of the form. That's the only change to that one. Super simple, but just that little disclaimer. I'm surprised it lasted this long without that. So that's that mobile home or manufactured or mobile home purchase addendum that gets included with the purchase agreement. The probate purchase agreement addendum was also updated. Number one, it gives us the option now of the property is part of a probate descendant's estate or conservatorship, guardianship, receivership, or other. So just know that it's in there. So if it's some sort of probate, in case there was an other line. And then down here it also clarifies that, hey, when court confirmation is required, right? Deposits maybe have, let's see, it says, if the sale is not confirmed to buyer due to overbid, right? Somebody else came in higher or whatever happened, and the court does not confirm that sale, or any other reason that's not the breach of the buyer, right? So buyer's not in breach, seller has to cancel because it wasn't confirmed or something happened. The buyer's deposit money less applicable costs shall be returned to buyer. So they just added this little caveat that, hey, if this is canceled due to any other reason that's not breached by the buyer gets their deposit back. Okay, so they just added that little verbiage in there. So that again is the probate purchase agreement addendum, the PAPA. Then we get into our buyer contingency removals. So buyer contingency, they added 2D is that insurance contingency. So there's a whole new line item for that insurance contingency. Okay, it's also, hey, we're removing all buyer contingencies except insurance is down there as well. Okay, keep in mind too, I'm just going to remind everybody this, that if you have a contingency for the sale of the buyer's property, there's usually two parts of that contingency. Generally, it's the entering into contract of the buyer's property and the sale of buyer's property. So if we have that sale of the buyer's property as part of our contract, we don't want to remove all contingencies because we have now removed that contingency as well. So if it falls out last minute, that contingency is gone. So we always want to make sure that we check that box for contingency for the close of buyer's property. We remove all contingencies except that one. So just a little heads up on that. A little safeguard. So that's your contingency removal. We just added that insurance line. Okay. Here's that wooden balconies and stairs addendum. So this is that new one. So again, we would want to use this anytime the unit is a triplex, fourplex, or more. And this one is just going to go over that, hey, this is an addendum, right? Balconies, exterior stairways, and other elevated elements. If a building on the property contains 3 or more units and has balconies, decks, stairways, or other structures extending beyond the exterior walls of the building, which are at least 6 feet above ground level. Okay, 6 feet. So if it has like 2 wooden stairs into the front door, that doesn't count. It's got to be 6 feet. So if it's got, a balcony on the 2nd story, if it extends out over a hillside, whatever that would be, then that's going to count. It could be a deck, right? Um, and supported whole or in part by wood or wood-based products. So if it's supported by cement, we don't have to worry about it. But if it's wood-based, these would be elevated elements. The Health and Safety Code requires that an inspection of elevated elements be completed by January 1st, 2025, and at least every 6 years thereafter. If the inspection report indicates that the inspector advises that there is immediate threat to safety of occupants and requires corrective work for non-immediate threats, then the owner must take the appropriate corrective measures required under the Health and Safety Code. This will be used not for condos, Rebecca, because you're still only selling the single unit. The property contains 3 or more units. You know what? I'm rethinking that, Rebecca. This does not clarify that. No, it's going to include. No, it does not apply to a condo. I'm sticking with my original answer. Does not include condos. Let's see. Health and Safety Code obligates the owner to maintain copies of the inspection reports for not less than 2 inspection cycles. So that would be 12 years, ultimately. If we have to have it done every 6 years, then we've got to hold on to those reports for 12 years. So you should be able to get copies of them after January 1st, 2025. Requirement to deliver reports to buyers. Seller shall, within the time specified in paragraph 3N, deliver to buyer an inspection report of the elevated elements prepared within the preceding 6 years pursuant to the Health and Safety Code, showing that the elevated elements are in proper working condition and do not pose a threat to health or safety, or if the report shows any portion of the elevated element are in need of repair, a copy of the report and evidence that the indicated elevated elements have been corrected in accordance with the code permit requirements, or up until January 1st, 2025, disclose if no such report has been made or repairs completed. And if you're going to ask me, who's going to do these reports, Amy? I don't know the answer to that question. When a property is in a common interest development, the requirements under the Health and Safety Code do not apply to the owner of a property in a common interest development. Those would be your condos and your townhomes. However, the association will have similar obligations, but the inspection is required every 9 years. The report should be kept and incorporated into the association's reserve studies. So you'll still get it. It's every 9 years, and it should be part of those HOA docs that you're getting. Okay, but the seller themselves don't have that obligation. So that is the wood balconies and stairs addendum. Wah, wah, wah. Again, it only applies to triplexes and more, or we'll get it from the association for condos. Okay, proceeding on. The Buyers Homeowners Association Advisory. So this is for somebody who has a homeowners association. So those condos, those HOA communities. It's just stating here that, hey, as part of the financial information, we should also get that wood balcony stairs and other structures along with reserve requirements. Okay, so prior to January 1st, 2025, buildings with 3 or more units may be required to obtain an inspection of exterior balconies, stairways, walkways, and decks that are supported in whole or substantially in part by wood or wood-based materials. For condos, the HOA will be responsible for the inspections per governing documents. An inspection report must be incorporated into the condo's HOA study of reserve account requirements. This could in turn affect lender certification requirements as well as future dues and assessments. A balcony report that identifies an immediate threat to the safety of the occupants will require the condo, HOA, or owner to prevent access to the balcony, further impacting the property's marketability. Notice I didn't say we had to actually repair them in that statement. It just says, hey, prevent access. So that was updated on the Buyers Homeowners Association advisory. If there is a homeowners association, you should be including this form. It's a good form because it makes them aware of all the minutes and financial information and what they should be, rental restrictions, lending considerations. Here, it talks about additionally, lenders will generally require the HOA to have a general insurance policy covering the HOA, which has become less available and more costly in California due to rising replacement costs and increase in natural disasters. So HOAs, well, generally, it's not always HOAs. It's usually like the HOA insurance usually covers the common areas, but like on a condo or an HOA where they're attached buildings, then it usually covers the exterior of the structures. Any questions on any of the forms so far? Any additional questions? All right, we're just moving right along then. We have our cancellation of contract, disposition of deposit, and cancellation of escrow. I'm really excited about the change on this form. Some things make my heart happy. Sometimes they make me sad. This one makes my heart happy because down here, it talks about if check, the seller agrees to pay buyer out-of-pocket expenses for inspection reports and appraisal fees as specified in the agreement, buyer shall deliver receipts of such expenses to the escrow holder. Thank you for including this, because sometimes, like, we have a property, you'll see on the seller's purchase of replacement property, like they have a contingency for the purchase of replacement property. They can't find the replacement property. They cancel on the buyer. The buyer has already spent money on inspection reports. This allows that new SPRP allows for the buyer's expenses to be given back to the buyer from the seller upon cancellation, which I think is fair. If the seller cancels, not if the buyer cancels, but just if the seller cancels. So our cancellation of contract also reflects that change as well. So keep in mind this already has to be agreed to as part of the agreement, or if it's like mutual cancellation, that might be a conversation that we have. If the seller, for whatever reason, is like, man, we don't want to sell anymore, we want to cancel. And the buyer's like, yeah, that's fine, but like pay us back for our inspections. The seller says, hey, if you'll let me out of this so I don't have to move, absolutely, we can check this box here, but otherwise it needs to be part of the agreement, and you'll see that here in a minute. But it allows that buyer to get paid back. We used to write this in when it would, Heather, that's a good question. If it was paid on behalf of the buyer, the reimbursement, the fee would probably go back to the buyer, and then the buyer would need to reimburse you for those. I recommend that you don't pay for inspections on behalf of your buyers, because that becomes a really sticky situation. Because if the buyer doesn't like something in that inspection, they could cancel and then you would be out that money. But if you do, that's between you and the buyer. You could probably write up instructions as well. You would do like an addendum to this, or a modification of terms for the buyer or the buyer representation broker compensation agreement, stating that buyer's agent to pay for the cost of home inspection and pest inspection, not to exceed X number of dollars. In the event that the contract is canceled, list our buyer's agent to be reimbursed directly from buyer's deposit in escrow. Then you could give that document to the escrow agent so that part of that would go to you instead of them, but it might get messy that way. All right. Buyer shall deliver such receipts. So there you go. That's the cancellation of contract. Oh, the agent visual inspection disclosure. This is exciting because in the past, we've been required to submit a separate avid for each unit of the multi-unit property, and now we can include it for all units. Okay, I personally would still recommend doing a separate avid for each unit, because I think it's cleaner and nicer that way, and then that makes sure that we don't miss anything. And I think when we come to like a court hearing, right, something happens with that property and we have to go before a judge or whatever, I think having separate avids for each unit so we know specifically which unit we're referring to is going to make it cleaner and nicer. But it does allow us that the avid form is for all units. Part of the reason this might come into play now is that we're starting to see so many like ADUs and stuff added to properties. And this means that we can do one avid for the main structure and the ADU. I would specify, like if I was using Glide for my avid, I would say ADU living room, ADU bedroom one, but we could do it on the same avid. You could also do that with multi-unit. You do unit one, bedroom two, right? Like whatever that is. So we can use it, or we would check this box here for only whatever unit this is being used for. So we would go all units or specific units there. So that's the major change there. They also, in addition to that, they realized that 3 bedrooms is not enough. So we now get a 4th bedroom option. Woohoo! We also get a 4th bathroom option. I think here is because they, made it all units, and this is only used for up to 4-unit properties. Once you get to a 5th unit, you no longer have to utilize this form anymore. We don't have to do an avid. So they assume that maybe on a 4-unit, you would have a bedroom and a bathroom in each unit, no more than one. So they gave us 4 bathrooms. Keep in mind that if you do it on Glide, you can put as many bedrooms and bathrooms as you want. It just goes to a text overflow addendum. So that's your changes there. The other change that they made is they moved it all down here to this box. So normally at the first part of the avid at the top, it says the inspection date and time and the weather conditions. It also asks for other person's presence. Now it says, hey, here's who did the inspection. Who is the firm? Who is the real estate agent? What was the inspection date and time? What were the weather conditions? Who else was present? And then the signature of the person who performed that inspection. Down here is the signature of the agent that's representing the client. Okay. So this is like buyer signs here, avid here. I'm just curious. Interesting. All right. Buyer has to sign, seller just initials. There you go. They changed the kind of the end of this. Seller initials, buyer signs, person who did the inspection goes there. And this is the person that did not fill out the avid. I don't know if it's going to be the listing agent or buyer's agent. I would say it's the buyer's agent signed here, listing agent. Or I guess if the listing agent completed the avid, they would sign up here. This is confusing to me. There used to be 2 signature lines. Now there's only 1. Because the agent who performed the inspection isn't always the agent who is the client's agent. Yeah, it's got an initial now, Melina, just for the seller. But the seller's agent is legally required to provide an avid. So I guess if it would be, okay, buyer's agent. Buyer signs, buyer's agent down here. You're going to have a second one where the buyer's also going to sign, but this would be the listing agent signature. And then
So I had an outside TC kick it back the other day and said the seller legally does not have to sign it because it says that or initial it, I'm sorry. But I'm just saying our office is requiring it. So if they do kick it back, then I guess stick that email in SkySlope, but try to fight back if they tell you they don't have to initial it.
Yeah, we used to have the rule, not at this brokerage, at a previous brokerage where you actually had to make the request 3 times. So I don't know if that's something maybe you want to have a conversation with Ed about, but we used to have to make the request 3 times. And on the 3rd refusal with the, with proof that we requested it multiple times, then we could get away with it. So that might be one way to make sure.
No, our office still requires a 3 times pushback too as well.
Yeah, so that makes sure that we're being persistent and asking.
Yeah, but I'm just saying for anybody that uses like an outside TC or anything in that sort.
Yeah. So seller is not required, but they do have an initial spot. But the seller's agent is required to do an avid. So one of these would be signed by the buyer with the listing agents, and one would be signed by the buyer with the buyer's agent signature. So just so you guys know. Okay, dokes. All right. Then we have our buyer's homeowner's insurance advisory that was updated. Here we go. Property insurance and purchase contract terms, right? The cancellation right may be a specific contingency pertaining to the insurance or may be part of the overall investigation contingency. If buyer removes the applicable contingency before determining availability and cost of property insurance, buyer is acting against the advice of the broker. Additionally, if the property is part of an HOA, lenders may require the buyers will want to know that the HOA has adequate insurance to cover the areas for which the HOA is responsible. Wah, wah, wah. Due to rising replacement costs and an increase in natural disasters, right? So there, here we go. Some insurance carriers have stopped issuing new property insurance policies and others are limiting the number and location of new policies. They just added the, hey, due to rising costs and an increase in natural disasters. So that's in there as well. We did have, just so everybody knows, we had a property recently that we had to fight with insurance on. We had problems getting insurance for it, not because of the rising costs or the increase in natural disasters, but there had been a large insurance claim on the property a couple of years ago. And all the current insurance carriers were requiring proof of the money, of the amount of the claim. They wanted like itemized bills showing where that money went to so that they could prove that the repairs were made. Even though you could see permits were pulled, we had to track down because there had been 2 owners since then. We had to track down the previous listing agent, to track down the previous owner, to try to get the documents or get the insurance information. We were having problems getting it. The property almost wasn't insurable because we couldn't track down all this stuff. So just a heads up on that. So not only are they cutting back policies and having issues, you know, when you're near fire areas, but there's all these other issues that are now causing red flags and causing them to not want to insure properties. Here's the contingency for the sale of the buyer's property is our next one, our COP form. They added here, not just, hey, what's the escrow number if the property's already in contract, but also what is the contractual close of escrow date. So I'm glad that they've added that to that form because I think it just helps to build our case and it helps make everybody aware of, hey, we're already in contract and the anticipated close of escrow date is X. Okay, so that's the only difference there on the COP form. They just added that little line there so you could put, if it's already in contract, what the close of escrow date should be. The assignment of agreement addendum, remember this is how we add buyers, we take buyers off, or we change the buyers completely. Okay, so you do 3 things with this form. Those are the 3 options. Down here at the bottom, they just added an or. Buyer has not and will not receive any monetary consideration from assignee for this agreement, or buyer has received and will receive consideration from the assignee in the amount of X number of dollars. It has to be disclosed to the seller if the buyer's receiving compensation. And you're like, hey, how would you do this? Well, this is what investors are doing, right? You have what you call wholesalers picking up properties with a contract, getting a good deal on it. They turn around and find somebody that's willing to pay $20,000 more than what we're in contract for the property. They get the difference, right? Hey, I found the property for you. I've got it in contract. They don't say I've got it in contract, but they say for $20,000, I'll sell it to you for, you know, $400,000 instead of what they're in contract on $380,000. So that's usually when the compensation is received. It's not a big deal. It just has to be disclosed. And now it's an or. So it's either defaults to they have not and will not, or we check the box that they have or will receive consideration. Okay. Down here, they did the entity. So if it's, you were assigning it to the entity, same thing that we saw in the purchase agreement, which is the probate court clarification of how we would write out the name. Dun, dun, dun. All right, here's that DEDA form. DEDA. The designated electronic delivery address amendment. So if we're going to clarify or change things versus the contract, so remember the contract defaults to whatever the email address is that we put on our signature block. That's our designated electronic delivery email address. And as soon as they fire off an email to us, it's considered delivered. Okay. Even if it goes in our spam mail, we don't care anymore. Once that send button, they have proof that they sent it to the correct email address, that counts as delivered. So this form's always been here. Did anybody know this form was in the forms library? I mean, I feel like I know most forms and I've never heard of this form. So it's revised, it's not new. Buyer's agent designated electronic delivery address. The address below, if completed, are intended to replace the designated electronic delivery addresses, if any, specified in the agreement for the buyer's authorized agent. You would put the email here or alternate email here. You could also put your text there. If checked, delivery shall be made to the alternate designated electronic delivery address only. Anyways, there you go. Alternate only if we check that box. Sellers get the same option here. The address below, if completed, are intended to replace all designated electronic delivery addresses, if any, specified in the agreement. So they get the same boxes there, same box to be checked if we just want it sent to the alternate. Effective date of electronic delivery when sent, unless paragraph 4 is checked. Delivery to any designated electronic delivery address above shall be effective when sent, as per the agreement, even if the opt-out was selected previously. So if we selected the opt-out of designated electronic delivery, and then we realized how inconvenient that was and that we would like things delivered electronically, we could come back and say, hey, nope, here's the new one. Then it counts as when sent. Here, box 4 is the opt-out. Opt-out, if checked. The act of sending in of and of itself of any notice document to the designated electronic delivery address shall not constitute delivery. Delivery to any designated electronic delivery address above shall only be effective when possession when in possession of the party or authorized agent. Honestly, if I were you guys, I would include this DITA form every single offer. Why would I include this? Because I would check this opt-out button every single time so that just because somebody sent it doesn't mean I received it and it doesn't count as delivered. I actually have to have possession of it for it to count as delivered. We go back to the old way of doing things. Personally, I think that's better because if it went to my spam folder, somebody sent it at 11:58 p.m. and now my acceptance, I wasted a whole day in acceptance of my contract because they sent it right before midnight, and that now counted as day 0 and 12:01 counts as day 1. Personally, I would include this DITA form with the opt-out button checked. Hey, I actually have to receive it. It has to be in my possession. But that's up to you. All right, there we go. Buyer, seller, everybody signs it. DITA form, DEDA. Delivery, our designated electronic delivery address amendment. All right, the next one is the probate advisory, listing addendum and advisory. Again, we have that other box checked just like the addendum did above, where we could say it's a conservatorship, guardianship, receivership, or other. That's the only change to that form. This would go with, at time of listing, you would sign this as well. Our demand to close escrow, right? So we have a notice to perform and then we have demand to close escrow. We use different forms for different situations. Our demand to close escrow, notice to the buyer, if you do not close escrow by the end of the time period specified in this demand to close escrow and seller has fully performed, seller may do any or some combination of the following: cancel the agreement, bring legal action against you for damages, including but not limited to the deposit, bring legal action against you to force you to buy the property. Okay. So that's the top one. The bottom one says the same thing. Hey, seller. The first one is demand to the buyer to close escrow. The second one, the buyer can actually give the seller a demand to close escrow as well. Hey, seller, if you don't close escrow by the time specified in the demand to close escrow, buyer has fully performed. Buyer may do any or some combination of the following: cancel the agreement, bring legal action against you because of the breach of contract, bring legal action against you and force you to sell the property. Okay, those are the options there. So it's just is adding, clarifying, and then added cancel the agreement. All right, our notice to the buyer perform now includes, hey, remove that insurance contingency. And then everything got relabeled because of the fact that we added D in there. So that's really the only difference on the notice to buyer to perform is now we've got that insurance contingency in there. So you'll see it on the contingency removal. You will also see it on the notice to buyer to perform. The interim occupancy agreement, right? So this is used if we're going to occupy the property for 30 or more days. Okay. We've changed it from landlord to housing provider. So you'll see that in there. So you see housing provider all the way down. It talks about the maximum amount of security deposit paid on or before the initial occupancy, however designated, cannot exceed 1 month's rent unless an exception applies. See security deposit exception disclosure and addendum car form SDDA for additional information. So that outlines what that security deposit can be. Security deposit is in addition to any advance payment of the first month's rent. Security deposit law does not prohibit the payment of advanced rent if not less than 6 months rent in the term of the lease 6 months or longer. Ooh, and then we got housing provider. This, I'm surprised they didn't do this with the last forms update because most of these they updated with on all the rental forms, housing provider, because we don't want it to be a lord anymore. No landlords, just housing providers. Personal property belonging to the seller or housing provider at the close of escrow of the purchase of the premise shall be removed by the housing provider and buyer tenant shall provide access. The following items of personal property are included on the premise without warranty and housing provider will not maintain, repair, or replace them. Personal property belonging to the seller at the close of escrow of the purchase of the premises shall be removed. Oh, those items not, so it's just saying the seller can take their personal property with them. please remove their personal property. Let's see here. Housing provider, housing provider, housing provider, housing provider. Those are all the other updates so far. I feel like there's there we go. Additional disclosures. The RPO shall make additional disclosure regarding the following matters if applicable on the rental property owner disclosure form. That's the RPOD, lead-based paint, methamphetamine, periodic pest control contracts, water submeters, mold, asbestos, homeowners association, condominiums, plan developments, military ordnance locations, death on the premise. So we would use form RPOD for those. Legally authorized signer. It's just talking about wherever the signature initials legally authorized signer, it's deemed signed. So it's just telling you that if it's a represented capacity disclosure type thing. Here, they included the representative signature capacity disclosure, just like you'd find on the purchase agreement for the buyer or the tenant. And then for the housing provider as well. Here's the real estate broker's box. Unless otherwise agreed, compensation for this interim occupancy agreement is included in any compensation received from the purchase of real property described in this agreement. It's just defaulting that, hey, you're not getting paid extra to negotiate this. Any questions about that interim occupancy agreement? All right. Single party compensation agreement. There are two compensation agreements that you're going to see. One is the single party compensation. The second one is the, oh, it's not there. It's supposed to be right next door to it, but it's the just compensation agreement. Single party compensation agreement. This would be used like, let's see, the seller. If you were representing the buyer, you're going to have a BRBC in place representing the buyer. But this would be like if the seller, if we don't have a listing agreement in place with the seller. And you're like, Amy, how would we not have a listing agreement? Well, we're not necessarily selling the property for them or like in a listing capacity. We're just negotiating the sale between a landlord and a tenant or a mother and a daughter or whatever that would be, right? We aren't necessarily listing that property, but we are representing the seller in the sale. So this would be like, hey, we're just like this is how we're getting compensated. We've covered this form before. I covered all the different types of compensation forms that you can include. But this one, they've added the agency relationships. If the property includes residential property, commercial property, or mobile home and is being sold, leased, or for a period exceeding 1 year, broker acting as an agent for the principal shall give principal an agency disclosure form prior to presenting an offer to purchase or lease. So, hey, if we're going to represent them in an agency capacity, this is generally like there's no agency capacity. They're just saying, hey, if you negotiate the sale, I don't really want you to represent me in an agency, but I'll pay you for it, right? Representation, brokers act as an agent for the principal exclusively in any resulting transaction. Broker will act as dual agent. So in a like landlord tenant situation, are we representing just the seller of the property? Are we representing both parties in this transaction? Broker will act as agent for the other party exclusively in any resulting transaction. Hey, seller's paying me. It's a for sale by owner. It's a FSBO property. I'm not representing the seller. Seller's offered me compensation for it. I'm filling out this form, but I'm checking this box that, hey, I'm acting only as an agent for the buyer. Okay. So either we're representing the seller exclusively just in this transaction, but we don't have a listing agreement in place. We're acting as a dual agent for both parties. Right? Or we're acting as an agent just for the buyer. So those are your three options there. Whew, so complicated. If we're representing the seller, so if we check boxes 1 or 2, we need to provide that agency disclosure. Okay, if we're representing number 3, the buyer already got the agency disclosure with their BRBC that they signed with us. Okay. Confirmation, broker shall confirm agency relationship described above or as modified in writing prior to the concurrent with seller's execution of the purchase agreement. That's disclosed in the purchase agreement itself. Potentially competing buyers or sellers, right? We've got the possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. Same thing that we see in like the listing agreement. Termination, the principal acknowledges and agrees that the representation duties of and agency relationship terminate with the expiration of this agreement, or if it occurs first, the completion of the transaction. So same things as normal. Talks about, hey, why you should have probably listed your property in the MLS and images. All terms of the transaction, including sales price financing, may be provided to the MLS, even if the property was not listed in the MLS, right? We still want our listing count. Seller consents to broker providing information so we can submit it to the MLS for proof of sale or as a comp. That's basically it on this one. Oh, and then we have the clarification of the entity down there, just like we've seen on all the other forms. Any questions about the single party compensation form? Single party. All right. We have our market conditions advisory. Just talks about, hey, non-contingent offers down here. They added that if the buyer is dissatisfied with the property's condition after an inspection, if an insurance policy can't be obtained for acceptable cost, or for any other contingency with the purchase within the purchase agreement, right? So it's just saying that, hey, like we have contingencies in there to make offers more attractive, and including these things like, you know, after you do inspections, if the property is not insurable, to make offers more attractive, buyers will sometimes write offers with few or no contingencies, right? To or offer to remove contingencies within a short period of time. It's just saying that. And then it also says, hey, broker recommends that buyers do not write non-contingent offers. If you do so, you are acting against the broker's advice. However, if you do write a non-contingent offer, these are some of the contractual rights you might be giving up. Loan contingency, appraisal contingency, investigation contingency, and now we have the insurance contingency written in there as well. So all those were previously in there. We just added insurance. If you cannot obtain insurance or disapprove of the cost and you do not purchase the property, you may be legally be in default under the contract and required to pay damages to or forfeit your deposit to the seller if you have removed your insurance contingency. Wah, wah, wah. So that's the market conditions advisory. Just so everybody knows, market conditions advisory goes out with every listing agreement I send out and every purchase agreement I send out, because this, if it's not signed at the time or before the offer is signed or the listing agreement, it's kind of null and void at that point. So it should be signed at the same time or before. Once they've signed one, they don't have to sign another one. All right, non-contingent offer advisory. This is revised. There was always here. So if you've got somebody that's going in with no contingencies, I recommend including this form as well, the non-contingent offer advisory. It's the NCOA, the NCOA. I don't know if that's how you'd really say it, but we're just going to go with that because it sounds cool. Non-contingent offers. Right, same idea as above, that most residential purchase agreements contain contingencies, allowing a buyer a specified period of time to cancel. That includes things like if the buyer is dissatisfied with the property's condition after inspections, or if an insurance policy cannot be obtained for an acceptable cost. Each contingency may stand alone and may not be the reason to use a different contingency. For example, cannot use the loan contingency because of a low appraisal, even if that is the reason the lender denies the loan. If you remove a specific contingency and try to cancel for that reason, you may be legally in default under the contract and could be required to pay damages to forfeit your deposit to the seller. I do appreciate that they're clarifying the terminology in this document to make it easier for buyers to understand. Loan contingency. Without this contingency, you cannot cancel if the loan is declined, whether through your fault or the fault of your lender, is what they added there to the loan contingency. And then we have our insurance contingency. An insurance contingency allows you to determine the availability and cost of insurance for the property. With rising replacement costs and increased natural disasters, insurance is becoming harder and more expensive to find. The ability to acquire insurance may affect your willingness to own the property and may affect the lender's ability to give you a loan. However, insurance contingency is not necessarily part of the investigation or loan contingency. You should investigate this early in the process. Okay, so it's just clarifying that, hey, it's not part of, if your loan gets denied because you can't get insurance, or if we have an investigation but we don't have insurance contingency, like that doesn't give you the right to cancel. Okay. Moving right along to our water conserving plumbing fixtures and carbon monoxide detector advisory. Requires all single-family residents, multifamily, and commercial built on before January 1st, 1994 to be equipped with water-conserving plumbing fixtures. I've clarified this before. Buyers advised to investigate the cost to bring any non-compliant water fixtures into compliance before removing the investigation contingency. So number one, if the house was built after 1994, it doesn't matter. If it was built before 1994 and they've replaced any fixtures since then, unless they literally drove across state lines, all the plumbing fixtures are compliant fixtures because you can't even have non-compliant fixtures shipped to the state of California. So you would have to drive across state lines, go buy them in a state that doesn't require it, and drive them back across state lines in order to have replaced those with non-compliant fixtures. Okay, so just keep that in mind. It's not a point of sale requirement for those to be changed. It's just a point of sale requirement for the seller to disclose if they know of any non-compliant fixtures. If the house was built in 1974 and it's still all original, none of the fixtures have been changed, then they are none of them are compliant. 100% guarantee. So it's just saying, hey, you're advised to investigate the cost to bring non-compliant fixtures before removing the investigation contingency. Chances are they were going to do updates anyways. So there you go. Requirements. As of January 1st, 2013, has required the following types of dwelling units intended for human occupancy. Oh, there we go. See, following types of dwelling units, they added just to make sure that it was intended for human occupancy to have carbon monoxide detectors installed. Single family dwellings, duplex, lodging house, dormitory, hotel, condominium, timeshare, apartment, among others. The law does not apply to a dwelling unit which does not have any of the following: a fossil fuel burning heater or appliance. That would be gas. If it has no gas in the property, if it doesn't have a fireplace, or if the garage is not attached. Okay, as any one of those things, one is required. So it's just updated that the date of which that requirement went into effect and which types of dwelling units that they have to be intended for human occupancy. It doesn't have to be in a garage. Okay, so that was the updates to the water conserving plumbing fixtures and carbon monoxide notice. Then we have our statewide buyer and seller advisory. And they updated a bunch of the paragraphs because they shifted some stuff around. And then they added on 69 that wood balconies, stairs, and other structures. So that was really the only addition. Is you'll just see down here this. Oh, look at, hold on, we'll come back to that one. They updated something with the rent too. Here and here. Just looking for that. There we go. Down here, the last thing, wood balconies, stairs, and other structures. Just talking about that new requirement that's going into effect there. I'm not going to read it because it's the same as everything else I've read with regards to that today. And then we'll pop back up here to the rental one. Rent and eviction control laws and ordinances. It just updated it to read. Just trying to find the beginning of the sentence. Buyer and seller advise that California and some cities and counties impose or may impose restrictions that limit the rent that can be charged to a tenant, the maximum number of tenants who can occupy the property, the right of the landlord to terminate tenancy and the cost to do so, and the consequences of terminating a tenancy unlawfully. Even if a property is currently vacant, was previously tenant occupied, the termination of that previous tenancy may affect the buyer's rights, such as legal use of the property and who may occupy the property in the future. If buyer wants further information, brokers recommend that buyer investigate the issues with the appropriate government authority and a qualified California real estate attorney during the buyer's inspection contingency period. So this brings up a good point, right? If the property is vacant, two things there. Number one, it's a good idea to ask the listing agent, was it previously tenant occupied, and was the tenancy terminated, or did the tenant just vacate the property and move out, right? You may want to ask for proof that it was terminated or that it was at the end of its lease term, right? So that we don't have any problems. Secondly, just so you know, if you have a listing that's vacant, I ran into this recently and unfortunately found out that most homeowners insurance policies, if you have sellers that are moving into a new property, leaving the state, whatever it is, before they put their property on the market, and that house is going to be vacant for more than 30 days, they need to call their insurance company and switch their policy over to a vacant home policy. Because if after that 30 days, if the property is still vacant, you haven't closed escrow on it, and somebody breaks into that property, their insurance will no longer cover theft or vandalism. Okay, so just a little heads up on that. So if you've got sellers, vacant properties, they need a vacant property policy, or their insurance will not cover if it's broken into. All right, there's your changes to the statewide buyer and seller advisory. Couple of good things there. And let's see here. We have our transfer disclosure statements. So again, we can do a TDS is required for all units of up to a fourplex. And is this TDS for all units, or are we doing them one for each unit? So that's your choice of how you want to do that, but it defaults to the TDSs for all units. And then down here, a C4 and C5. So this is, are you the seller aware of any of the following? Room additions, structural modifications, and other alterations or repairs made without necessary permits, or room alterations, structural modifications, or other alterations or repairs not in compliance with building codes. C4 and C5, if transfer acquired the property within 18 months of accepting an offer to sell it. Transferors shall make additional disclosures regarding the room additions, structural modifications, and other alterations or repair on a seller property questionnaire. So there's been things added to the SPQ to cover. So if I bought the property to flip it, is really where you're going to see this, or as an investor, and I'm turning around and reselling that property within 18 months, there's some additional disclosures that have to be done. Okay, and you don't have to be a flipper. It might be I've got somebody who purchased a property, like Kimberly's clients. I don't think they've been there longer than 18 months. The property she's selling, right? So they have some additional disclosures on that SPQ to make. So that's the TDS. It just adds that. And then we have the seller property questionnaire. So we'll show you where those changes are. First change is on the statutory or contractually required or related. Are you the seller aware of any inspection reports on any exterior balconies, stairways, or other elevated elements or buildings with 3 or more units on the property prepared within the last 6 years or 9 years for condominiums? It would be nice probably if there was like a does not apply, but there's not. So it's either yes or no. So if there's not any, because it doesn't apply, we just say no. Okay. The other ones, repairs and alterations, whether the property was built before 1978. Okay. If no, we're not doing 1 and 2, but if it's yes, then we're coming down and answering 1 and 2. If yes, whether any renovation, sanding, cutting, demolition of lead-based paint surfaces started or completed. If you're like, no, there weren't, then we move on. If yes, then we go to question 2. Whether such renovations were done in compliance with the Environmental Protection Agency lead-based paint renovation rule. Yes or no? Right? If your buyer or seller is uncomfortable answering these questions because they truly don't know, they could say, I don't know here, I guess would be an appropriate response, but otherwise it's yes or no. If yes, were such renovations done in compliance with the environmental, were they or not? I don't know, right? So have your seller answer those questions. Whether you purchased the property within 18 months of accepting an offer to sell it, yes or no? If yes, then we have to answer the rest of the questions. If yes, have any room additions, structural modifications, or other alterations or repairs, collectively improvements, been performed by a contractor while you have owned the property? Yes or no? If yes, seller shall provide an explanation below a list of such improvements and the name and contact information for each contractor who performs services of $500 or more. If yes to F1, seller to provide in the explanation below a list of those improvements for which the seller has obtained permits. And seller shall attach copies of those permits to this SPQ. And for those improvements for which the seller does not have a permit, seller shall include a statement identifying those improvements and that the seller was not provided permits by a third party making the improvement, and that the contact information for such third parties from whom the buyer may obtain those permits. And if we need more than a line to make that, we would check the box here for see attached. Okay, so those are the changes, the major changes there to this section of the SPQ. In addition to that, structural systems and appliances. Are you, the seller, aware of the existence of a solar power system? If yes, seller to provide form solar. Oh, look, we've included it in there. So now people know it exists. Thank you, SPQ. And then they, instead of solar system, they added the word power. Whether any structure on the property other than the main improvement is used as a dwelling. Okay, it's any other structure on the property used as a dwelling. If yes, whether there are separate utilities and meters for the dwelling, or whether the dwelling received a permit or other government approval as an accessory dwelling unit, an ADU. So that's the ADU disclosure. All right, there's, oh, here down on other, is the property tenant occupied, yes or no? And, oh, look at this, whether the property was previously tenant occupied, if vacant now. So we don't even have to ask, they have to disclose it. If yes, disclose, if you know the method or manner of how tenancy was ended. So this attaches to that previous disclosure that we had. Material facts, any past, present, known material facts or significant items affecting the value and desirability of the property, not otherwise disclosed to the buyer. Right? Additional comments there. So, hey, I wasn't sure where to put it above, but I want to disclose it. Here's where it is. Again, generally, when I have my sellers fill out the TDS and the SPQ, I send them also the disclosure information advisory, because it very plainly explains to them what their disclosure requirements are. If you're sending these out through Glide, which you can, Glide sends out the disclosure information advisory, or the verbiage from it, at least, not the actual one to be signed, but the verbiage of it before they start answering questions. So it walks them through what should be disclosed. Any questions on that TDS or the SPQ? Remember, it's not our job to help our seller or to walk our seller through filling this out. The seller is supposed to fill it out to the best of their ability, because we never want to be the one liable for, in a court case where the seller says, oh, well, Amanda was helping me complete that and she told me to mark no. No, don't help them. They have to answer it to the best of their ability. Okay. That's why that disclosure information advisory, if you haven't read it, read it, provide it to your sellers. You can go over that disclosure information advisory with your sellers to make sure they understand their rights. Amanda, are you going to yell at me for using you?
No, but I do have a question, because I have seen TDSs being redone by the agents. Like, if they're like, no, that's material fact, you have to disclose that. And then it's like, I've seen like it scratched out with like the agent's initials. Like, I've seen some weird stuff.
Yeah, so if the TDS, if you feel like there's inaccurate information provided by your sellers on the TDS, I would do an addendum to the TDS, and I would say, agent is aware of the following material issues. And just note those items. Yeah, or if the seller comes to you and they're like, oh my gosh, Amanda, I filled out that question for you, and then I was laying in bed 2 nights later and realized that I totally forgot to disclose this information. I remembered this. No problem. We just do an addendum to the TDS. Yep.
Thank you. That makes more sense. Yeah, I was like, I think this is an old school way of doing things where agents are like handwriting and then crossing out. And then I was like, what is happening?
Yeah. Back in the day, we used to fill these out for our sellers. Like, we'd sit down with them, but we'd be the one filling them out. That's a no-go. No-go.
Got it. Thank you.
Waiting to happen. All right. Here's the compensation agreement. Okay, so before we had the single party compensation agreement, we're receiving compensation from one party, whether we have a agency relationship with them or not, right? This one is a compensation agreement. This is what we use if there's no listing agreement, no buyer representation agreement, or no single party compensation agreement. We use this other compensation agreement. Compensation is payable if principal enters into an agreement on the above described property no later than, right? So it's saying, hey, we enter into agreement there. This talks about the same thing that we mentioned in the other one, right? That we may include terms and stuff to the MLS, so we can put it in for comp purposes and for us to get credit for it in our numbers. We've got the legally authorized signer information that we've seen in most of the documents today. So that's the only changes to this one. So again, this would be, hey, I'm getting compensated. I'm not representing the seller, not necessarily representing the buyer. You're not gonna see this very often anymore. The reason being is that the BRBC is now required for buyers. So if you're representing a buyer, it's still gonna be a single party a compensation agreement, or we're just being compensated from the buyer directly, right? At which point we would not fill out this compensation agreement or the single party compensation agreement. So if the buyer's paying us for a transaction, we don't represent the seller, we're not getting compensated by the seller, then we're just getting compensated by the buyer. If we're getting compensated by the seller, we're not representing the seller, we're representing the buyer, we would use single party compensation. Or we're representing the seller just in this one transaction, but we're not representing the buyer, we could use the single party compensation. We could use that in place of a full listing agreement for the case that we're not putting the property on the market. We're just representing them in the sale of a property. Okay. They come to us and say, hey, I've got somebody who wants to buy my property. I need you to like represent me because I don't know what I'm doing. I need somebody to protect me. Then instead of doing a full listing agreement, we can use that single party compensation agreement. We can also use it if we're representing both the buyer and the seller. So remember, there was that case there for dual agency where, again, we don't have a listing agreement in place. We would use that single party compensation agreement. This one we would use if we're not representing the buyer, there's no listing agreement, single party compensation. I suppose we could utilize this in lieu of a listing agreement as well. So you might see this as well in lieu of a listing agreement, you might use this one. But again, we're not going to use this for a buyer. We always have that BRBC now. And it just clarified some stuff there. I know these forms can be confusing. It's all right. We're going to get more and more comfortable with these as time progresses because we're going to see a lot of these forms more often. We have our seller's license to remain in possession addendum. So our SIP form. So remember we had our, oh, you know what I realized? Hold on. Earlier, I think I called it the interim occupancy agreement, and that's what it was. But this is for the interim occupancy agreement is when the buyer is going to occupy the property before the close of escrow. So that's why this seemed confusing to me here. So the interim occupancy agreement is not the residential lease after sale. This is for the buyer occupying the property prior to the close of escrow. It's intended for less than or for 30 days or more, where the buyer is going to be in possession prior to the close of escrow. CAR form IOA. We already talked about this one. The security deposit was updated. And then it also talks about the fact that seller was going to remove their possessions. And I was confused with that statement because I was thinking the seller was remaining in possession. No, this is where the buyer's taking possession. So this is saying that, hey, all the seller's belongings are going to be removed from the premise. And the following items are included in the sale. And they'll stay without warranty. So that's what that was saying there. Sorry, just backtracking a little bit to provide clarity there. I apologize. All right, so we did that one. We did that one. Hold on, I'm just finding where we were at. TDS, SPQ, SIP. All right, this is the seller in possession. So this is when the seller is remaining in possession up to 29 days after the close of escrow, not more than 29 days. Maintenance, seller make reasonable efforts to maintain the property, right? Including pool, spa, landscaping, grounds, and all personal property included in the sale in substantially the same condition as on the date of acceptance of the agreement. However, the seller is not responsible for latent defects or any damage or destruction that is not caused by the seller or is out of the control of the seller. For example, the pipe starts leaking in the wall in the bathroom. Like, that's outside the control of the seller. Buyers advised to obtain homeowners insurance to cover any damages that may occur after the close of escrow and consult with an insurance agent regarding the coverage in light of this license for the seller to remain in possession, right? Because it may need that for the first 13 days that the seller's remaining in possession, it may need to be a landlord policy versus a homeowner's policy so that it's covered appropriately. So they need to talk to their insurance agent about that. But I do like that it's, hey, the seller's not responsible for things that are outside of their control. The tree falls on the property, outside my control. The wind knocks the fence over, outside of my control. That's not my responsibility. All right, so that's your seller in possession, the SIP form. Then we have our tenant occupied property addendum. This is our TOPA form. This is what we use anytime we're putting an offer in on a property that is tenant occupied. Here we have, if the seller, the property to be delivered vacant is the box that gets checked. The property or unit shall be delivered vacant. We pick which unit, right? So I don't know if you all knew this, but like FHA loans, you can use an FHA loan on a 1 to 4 unit property as long as you're going to occupy one of the units, which means we need to give notice to one of the tenants to move out if the buyer's going to use an FHA loan to buy the property and move into one of those units. It's a really great way using that FHA loan because it counts as owner occupied to get into investment properties, multi-unit investment properties. Great way to utilize that. Okay. We can pick which unit we want vacant. The seller, after exercise of good faith, attempts and subject to applicable laws, unable to remove the tenant by close of escrow. Okay, the default is close of escrow, or we could check the box 5 days prior to close of escrow. Buyer may cancel this agreement, and buyer's sole remedy shall be the return of the deposits and buyer's reasonable out-of-pocket expenses for inspection reports and appraisal fees under this agreement, which the total amount shall be no more than X, right? We're limiting that amount. That means that we should probably have a conversation with the buyer before we write the offer of, hey, what kind of inspections do you want? We should make sure we know what that's going to cost. And we should have a conversation with the lender over how much they think that appraisal is going to be. Because an appraisal on a single family residence is somewhere around $700 to $800 for the most part. And an appraisal for a multi-unit property is going to be more. So we want to know what that is so that if my buyer spends money on these and then the seller can't get that tenant out of the property, then my buyer can get reimbursed. Okay, the buyer may also elect to proceed with a transaction with the tenant in possession and waives any claim for damages or compensation rising out of the tenant's remaining in possession. So those are the options there under 2, but that's what it added. It just gave us a, hey, let's mark that with a ceiling. Let's not make it a blank. And if it was my property, I was the listing agent for a property that's tenant occupied. We had this TOPA form and it says this, I would want a cap. So I'm going to fill this out ahead of time probably and have it in my home light listing management file for the buyer to sign and agree to because I want it to be under my agreement. And I'm going to say, hey, my seller's willing to, but they're going to cap it at $1,500 or we're going to cap it at $2,000, right? Whatever that is, so that it's not the buyer decided to spend $7,000 on inspections and now my seller is responsible to reimburse that if we can't get the tenant out. I don't want that to be the case. So I'm going to put a cap on that. So that's the only change there on that TOPA form. We want to use that TOPA form anytime there's a tenant in possession, and a tenant in possession would be anybody but the legal owner of the property would be a tenant, even if they're not paying rent. Okay. The next form is our seller's purchase of replacement property, our SPRP. We just updated buyer's costs. So seller cancels pursuant to paragraph 6A or B, seller shall return any deposit and if checked, only if checked, after delivering receipts to escrow holder, buyer shall be entitled to buyer's reasonable out-of-pocket expenses for inspection reports and appraisal fees under this agreement, which the total amount should be no more than X. Again, we're going to check that box if we're going to cap it. As a seller, I would want it capped. As a buyer, I'd probably not want it capped, but I'd probably write a number in there anyways. Right? So if seller cancels pursuant to paragraph 6A or B. Now, this all depends, right? Seller's purchase of replacement property. We have, hey, when are the time periods starting? When are the buyer's deposits due? But remember, sometimes it's finding and then also the close of replacement property. So oftentimes we don't start our inspections and appraisals until the sellers found that replacement property. So we're not out any money at that time if they never find one, but if they found one and then they end up canceling or something happens that escrow gets blown up, now we've paid for inspections and appraisals. So this paragraph is really important that this gets covered and that everybody understands how this works especially the agent on the other side. And keep in mind, this isn't, hey, the buyer canceled, this is the seller canceled. Okay, so that's your SPRP. It now includes that caveat as well, which I think is a good thing. Okay. Septic inspection, well inspection, property monument, and propane tank allocation of cost addendum. We use this, if there's a septic or a well or property monument or propane tank. Okay, property monument we don't deal a whole lot with, but propane tank, septic, or well. It can have either any one of those or all three. They've just updated down here for the propane tank. Number one is a propane tank leased or owned, right? That was always there. The seller shall, within the time specified in the agreement, disclose to buyer if the contact information for the propane service provider and any propane remaining in the tank shall convey as personal property to the buyer at no cost. That's the default. Propane they get whatever propane's left. Or the buyer shall reimburse seller for the cost of the remaining propane, which shall be measured no earlier than 5 days prior to the close of escrow. Okay, and that's, hey, propane company comes out and tells us how full the tank is, or if there's a meter on there, we figure out what the going rate is, and then we reimburse the seller for the cost of that propane. So they just updated that. Withdrawal of offer form. They've updated this. They made the text really big, so it filled the whole piece of paper. So, right, buyer has made an offer dated for the property known as in which, right, withdrawal and revocation of offer not yet accepted. The following document contains terms which have been proposed by buyer or seller. Was it a purchase agreement? Was it a counter offer? Was it the seller counter offer, seller multiple counter offer, a request for repair, seller response and buyer reply for request for repair, an amendment of existing agreement or terms or other, right? So which form are we referencing? According to the terms offer specified in paragraph A, the terms or offer have not yet been accepted. The buyer and seller making the offer hereby withdraws or revokes it. So it doesn't matter whether it's a purchase agreement, we would use this form. It could be a counter offer. It could be, hey, I made a request for repair and we decided that that wasn't what we did, so we're withdrawing it. It could have been an amendment, right? The AEA form, an amendment of existing agreement that we submitted, and we want to make changes to it, or it no longer applies, we can withdraw it. Confirmation of withdrawal or revocation. So this is, hey, we're making a withdrawal, or it could just be the confirmation. Generally speaking, most withdrawals are a confirmation. We've already called or texted. And now we're just clarifying. So we would check this box, confirmation of withdrawal and revocation. This document confirms that the offer was withdrawn orally, by text or by email or other, and revoked on date, time, like whenever you made that original communication to the other agent, and giving that notice to who did we text, email, or call. And if we want to attach substitute contractual documents. So where we see this a lot is we've made a seller counter offer to somebody. We get another offer in that may be a better offer, or maybe we want to counter both. We withdraw the original counter offer that we made. We hit this little box here that, hey, instead of that seller counter offer, it's going to be a multiple counter offer, a seller multiple. So I can counter both offers at the same time. So that's where we see this a lot. Or it could be, hey, we withdraw our request for repair and we're making a new request for repair, right? We could use that here. Otherwise, it's just withdrawing the form. If we made the request already known to them, we would check box 2. This would just be a confirmation of that withdrawal. Anytime you withdraw an offer, please make sure to follow it up with this form as confirmation in writing. And then whoever is withdrawing signs down here. Okay, so if it's the seller that's doing the withdrawal, they sign, or if it's the buyer, they sign. So that's your withdrawal of offer form, your WOO form. Seller instructions to exclude listing from the internet, and this isn't the SELM form, this is the SELI. So this is the one that's like, hey, I don't want the address online, or hey, I don't want the property to show up anywhere else except the internet, whatever that is. This just clarifies that we're supposed to submit everything with one business day of any public marketing to the MLS. That's the only change they made there. And then it says DRE. Okay, so that was a simple change there of just saying, hey, one business day of any public marketing is supposed to be in the MLS, just to clarify them. Then we have our verification of property condition form. Very similar to the original. We just added down here at the bottom. The evaluation of the condition of the property, including any items listed above, is based on a personal verification of the property by buyer or blank. Please don't do this on behalf of your buyers. Okay, if you want to go walk through the property, that's fine, but don't conduct their verification of property condition on their behalf. They should be there, video if they're not in town, if they've got somebody that can come for them, have somebody stand in the gap for them that's not you, because we want somebody else that they've chosen to be responsible for this, doing the walkthrough. So we're going to put in that name here if it's not the buyer, the date that it was performed on, and the time that it was performed, and or tests, surveys, inspections, or studies performed by inspectors selected by buyers, right? Or we waive the right. The point of the verification of property condition is to verify that the property is in the same condition and that any repairs were done as specified. So it might be that you have the home inspector come back or a pest inspector come back to verify that the repairs were done, but it needs to be a decision by the buyer, and you don't want to be the only person that does that verification of property condition, not your job. The next one is the solar advisory and questionnaire. So that solar form that was referenced previously in the SPQ. And they just made a little change down here. Regardless of whether the solar power system is owned, leased, or subject to a power purchase agreement, is there any transfer fee or any other fee for change of ownership? There is generally a fee for the change of ownership. This would be part of those private transfer fees, just so you know. Even sometimes they charge you to change the monitoring. Like usually there's a system that you can monitor, usually on your phone or an app or whatever. Oftentimes they charge you a fee to transfer that to the new owner. They like to get their money. Is there a maintenance agreement for the solar power system, right? So they did that as well. What's the monthly payment, right? What is the balance? Will the system still have a balance due on any financing, right? After the close, yes or no? What is the balance due, and what are the monthly payments due on the financing? This one's just if applicable, they added that in there. So that's your solar form there. They just made a couple of quick, easy changes, but just asking about this transfer fee. Your sellers probably need to make sure they call the company to verify if there's going to be any fees to transfer either monitoring or the system itself. All right. The broker compensation advisory, the BCA form. This is the one that gets attached to the purchase agreement and the listing agreement that talks about how compensation is paid out. This actually came in effect in May. Yes, that's why it says May. Sorry, I was thinking that they were selling this as a new form in June, but it came out last month. We've talked about this form multiple times. If we're talking about a seller, we want to highlight the listing portion, and if we're talking to a buyer, we want to talk to the buyer section. But this form is attached to either our BRBC or a listing agreement, and it's automatically attached now. And that is the end of our forms updates. Woohoo! Does anybody have any questions, thoughts, concerns, confusion that you want to address before we wrap up for today? I finished 8 minutes early. I'm really proud of myself. Thank you, Melina. You also have a fabulous 4th. You're welcome, Rebecca. Fabulous. And it was recorded, so if you want to re-reference, you're welcome to. None of the changes were super major. Some of the big forms coming out, like the open house one that they haven't decided yet, we'll figure that one out. As soon as we hear any news on that open house, we'll make sure to post it in all the groups so everybody's aware. Or if I see that form come out, I'll let you know. Fabulous. Everyone have a great day. No more trainings this week. The new calendar has not yet been released. I apologize for that. I've been traveling for the last 10 days. I'm feeling a little worn out. But I'm working on that calendar, so it'll be out. But no trainings this week for the holiday. And we are going to do a tech series for the rest of the summer, talking about tech. So see you all soon.